So my name is Jon Cornejo. My pronouns are he, him, or they, them, kind of flow between the two. And I'm an anti-racism consultant and activist and organizer. And I've been doing a lot of training and sort of conversations around anti-racism with organizations and communities all over the UK. And I think in that time, I've kind of lent a lot more to like the LGBT side of things as well. I'm queer myself, and there's a lot to unpack in terms of my own queer identities and my sort of Latin identity and all sorts of things. So I guess within all of that, what I want to do in this space is just open a really open and honest and expansive conversation around sort of racism within our community and how, and I guess just starting to talk about what work needs to happen to build anti-racist spaces and sort of be build spaces where everyone can bring their full selves. Because I think particularly thinking about my own identity, thinking about when I sort of started sort of coming to terms with gender and sexuality and everything else, it was very white coded. And I think a lot of what the perception of like LGBT culture in 2021 is very white coded, and it feels like it can be really hard to reconcile your sort of ethnic and cultural identities with sexuality and sort of all these other things, and it can feel like they don't go together. So with that in mind, I want to welcome our two wonderful speakers. Saima Razzaq is the head of diversity and inclusion at Birmingham Pride, and I'm really excited to have her with us. And Liv Andrews is a campaigner and fundraiser and a self-described outspoken Black lesbian feminist, and I'm super excited to have her here. We're going to open up just with just some introductions from them. I'm going to turn to Saima. You've got 5 minutes to chat what you think about this broad topic.
Cool. Okay. Thank you for having me. First of all, it's a positive step that we're having this conversation. These conversations are never easy. And sometimes when you're unpacking unconscious bias and racism, it's not always going to be pleasant, but that's part of the journey. And, you know, I think that's something everyone should be prepared for when we're tackling unconscious bias. I think as queer people, you know, we understand how society at large is homophobic and transphobic. And on the same hand, we should also be able to understand how we are othered as queer people, how Black people and people of color are othered for the color of their skin. I think that is really vital that we all start on the same page. And you know, in the same vein, we should also understand the importance of intersectionality, which essentially means that some of us might be at the intersection of many marginalized groups. So I myself, I'm a British, Pakistani, lesbian woman from a working class background. I think when we talk about intersectionality, we do often forget about class, but I think class is very important. Are we judging people on their appearance? Are we judging people on the way they speak? Are we judging people on where they live? I think it's really important for all of us to recognize that no one can control where they came from. There's no shame in growing up in one area or another. The key thing is, and we have to understand inherent privilege, and the key thing is how will we, and I'm very privileged to be here, to be invited here, to have this conversation, to be working at Birmingham Pride. And so the question for me is, how will I use my privilege to make the world a better place? And I think that's the key thing when we think about anti-discrimination and in particular anti-racism. We have to unpack a lot of inherent bias, you know, and there's no shame in that, but it's by understanding that we can move forward and work together to be inclusive and diverse as a queer community. So historically, as a queer community, we have catered to the white, cisgendered, queer, white male man, and in modern Britain, that just isn't the case now of queer communities. And just one last thing I would like to say, as somebody from the South Asian Indian subcontinent, you know, I often hear from a predominantly white queer community telling me that my community is homophobic, my community won't accept me. I'm living my best life as a queer Muslim, very open, very public. And the questions I ask myself is actually, where did that homophobia and transphobia first come from in the Indian subcontinent? And it's not an easy conversation to have, but we have to look at colonialism, and we have to look at the the homophobic and transphobic laws that were put into our home countries at the hands of British people. That's something I've had to come to terms with as a British person, because I am British. I was born here. So I think that's a nice place to start, and I'll hand it over to Liv.
Hi, everyone. So I mean, like, absolutely on the same tangent, I was going to say that, you know, colonialism and white supremacy is the enemy of any queer person, but particularly of queer people of color. And that is something that drives me, you know, sort of in my work. So yeah, a little bit of an introduction to me. So my name is Liv. I am a proud Black lesbian woman living in the UK. I have a Jamaican and Grenadian background, and I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of my heritage and my identity as a Black lesbian, and I make sure everybody knows it. And I think this conversation today is so important and so crucial, especially in the wake of the last year. And so my kind of introduction is going to touch on the last year, and as everybody remembers, last summer and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and how that affected me personally. So if I take you back to last summer, obviously we were all locked down inside our homes, and we all saw it happen. We saw it circulate around the internet, the death of George Floyd. And for me as a Black woman, that personally hit very, very hard. It was more amplified, I think, being at home than being locked down. And what set a fire in my belly wasn't just seeing a bunch of people talk about BLM and then it kind of fading to the background, but seeing people that I know from LGBT spaces talk all about this without acknowledging their own inherent racism, colorism, bias. And that, if I'm being honest, made me furious at the time. And the reason I'm here today, part of what kind of inspired me and brought me along this path, was that I wrote a blog piece entitled Dear White Gays. And I didn't expect it to go as far as it did. I'd say it went semi-viral. Even Rebecca Black, the amazing singer of Friday, retweeted it at one point. But in that piece, it was my raw emotion and a really passionate letter to white queer people to say that I need you guys to be doing more. I don't want to see you retweeting Black Lives Matter, posting your Black squares, posting all of this and that, but then not acknowledging your history and not acknowledging people like Marsha P. Johnson. Make it make sense, you know? And I have been kind of speaking on that ever since, because for me, my experience coming into this space, similar to what Jon said, is very white coded. It is not a space that is inherently accepting of people of color, and that's why we often go and we form our own spaces. I have been absolutely sustained and kept alive by QT spaces, particularly in my time in university, but it shouldn't have to be like that. And I think it is up to people to be open to the hard conversations. In general, when we're having conversations about anti-racism, we have to be open to the hard conversations. We have to be open to the fact that where this history comes from, you might not like it because it has a connection to you that you maybe didn't want to acknowledge, but you have to be prepared for it. And I am unapologetic in assuring that to people. And I push for that because that's the only way forward. We have to stop being afraid of getting things wrong. We have to stop being reluctant and defensive, and particularly in the LGBT community, we have to stop seeing it as a personal attack if somebody challenges us. You know, the importance of intersectionality is that there's multiple identities that can be affecting people. For myself, I'm a woman, I'm queer, I'm Black, but I also have multiple privileges. I'm middle class, grew up middle class, higher education, and I'm not afraid to admit that. But I know some people who are. We need to be having the bold and unapologetic conversations. And furthermore than that, we need to be doing the work, doing the brunt work. It's great to be having this conversation. It's great to be joining you this evening, but I don't want this to just be a one-time event. I want people, especially white people attending today, to really take on what gets said this evening and to think about how to embody that in their lives, and particularly within LGBT spaces. I think that's it from me.
And that was all really beautiful. And thanks so much both for sharing all of that. And I guess I want to open up the questions now. And also to everyone watching, if you do have a question, do pop it in the chat. I'll be monitoring that and kind of pulling questions together as we go, and we'll kind of drop them in and disperse them between other questions that I have. And I want to kick off just thinking about like, the role of queer people of color within the LGBTQ community. And I think just, you know, you named it there, Marsha P. Johnson, like, you know, Black trans women have been at the forefront of the fight for queer liberation. They've always been there. It is their work that has led us to where we are. But yet we look at the community we're in, and it does appear very white coded. I think we can kind of see a lot of invisibility of queer people of color, and I think there's a lot to unpack in that in general. So I guess the first question, just like with that kind of frame in mind, why do we need to talk about racism in the community? What does it look like? So let's spill some tea. Who'd like to go first?
I mean, I can jump on it. I was going to wait because I'd just been nattering on for the last 5 minutes. I mean, you kind of said it in and of itself, Jon, is that queer people of color are often the backbone of this community. They are the ones who are the carers, the laborers, the go-getters, the kickstarters. If we look at queer history, if we look at Marsha P. and Sylvia Rivera and Stormy DeLavery and think about who they are and what they sacrificed and how far it progressed us, give them their flowers. And we don't see that happen. And that's why we need to have this conversation. I think we're a marginalized group, obviously. As LGBTQ plus people, we are a marginalized group and we all share that in common. But that's sometimes where it stops and people kind of forget that. Everybody's experiences are different. What brings them to this point is different. How much people put in is different, and how much people have to lose is different. I think that this conversation needs to be had. I think that the last year really shone a light on anti-racism, and every charity and their mother is jumping to say that they're anti-racist now. But what action is that in actuality? And I think it's really, really important within spaces of people that are already marginalized by another identity. And so I feel like that is important. And it's also important for, I hate to use the word of like inherent bias and unconscious bias, because that's become a little bit whatever. But it is important to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge our unconscious biases, and then to acknowledge, you know, there is a massive racism problem in this community. There's a massive colorism problem in this community, and think about how have I contributed to that? And I say when it comes to colorism, I've contributed to that, you know, to be open to that. And I feel like the conversation, why we need to talk about it, is to improve for the community. This is a community that's constantly trying to improve for the next generation. You know, I have the rights that I do today as a Black lesbian woman in the UK due to the people who came before me, my queer elders, if you said. And in that respect, we need to keep it going. We need to say, we need to be bold, we need to be unapologetic, we need to keep it going. And what it looks like to me is conversations like this, spaces like this, you know, coming in and being open to learn, being open to be challenged, but also just conversations in between groups. You know, it doesn't have to necessarily be a big kind of sort of panel discussion like this. You can be having this conversation within your own LGBT spaces and really thinking, how do I embody anti-racism?
Yeah, so coming in on the back of that, well, first of all, you know, we exist. Black people and people of color from the LGBTQI community exist, and for far too long we've been silenced. Lady Phil, the founder of UK Black Pride, had to make UK Black Pride out of necessity. We had to create a separate event for ourselves. I think in Birmingham at the moment, Birmingham Pride are pioneering. They've brought in a whole suite of women of colour in leadership roles, and I think that is a start. But I think if we just look at everything, we look at the output, we look at the representation on TV, it's always white, cisgendered, queer men. So yes, this conversation is important, but we also need to be looking strategically, and how are you guys going to move out of the way? Because there are people who are going to have to move out of the way so that we can be decision makers. You know, there's so many industries that are affected. You can look at the arts. Who are the people who are predominantly commissioned through the arts? Who are the people who will continue to get this money? What chance do we have if people don't get out of the way? You know, one thing that really infuriates me, well, I'm still going to carry on though, but you know, whenever I speak up or challenge, and even now with my role in Birmingham Pride, you'd think people would show me a bit of respect. But no, I'm still seen as the troublemaker. I'm still seen as the angry brown lesbian. And what does that even mean? And yes, I am angry. You know, my ancestors died at the hands of colonialism. It was the British that brought in homophobia into the Indian subcontinent. So yes, we are angry, and you know, but at the same time, we need to have these conversations, and we shouldn't be pushed back. And our passion shouldn't be confused with anger. We're allowed to be angry, you know, and it's not just, you know, Black Lives Matter. So George Floyd was killed at the hands of racism, systematic racism. And then who's dying during COVID? Our communities. It's Black and brown people that are dying. So it's just endless trauma. It never ends. So sometimes, you know, if you're having these conversations, and you might find a situation difficult for yourself as a white person, and you might think, oh, that Black person or brown person or mixed race person, you know, I'm finding it difficult to deal with them. But understand that it's difficult to deal with trauma as well, and different people deal with trauma in different ways. So don't be afraid to have those conversations. And you know, it's going to hurt. It's not going to be easy, but that's not a bad thing, because when you come out the other side, I've unpacked so much. My mum was a child bride. She was married at 14. And then my dad was a banker in Pakistan, came here. He's not alive anymore, but he was cutting foam in a factory, you know, from being a successful man. That's been a big thing for me to unpack. Now, I could be angry about that, or actually I've unpacked it now and I can share their stories and make sure that these things don't happen again, or at least raise awareness. So it's the same thing with racism in the LGBTQI community. So like Liv said, you know, we have to have these difficult conversations, and sometimes there's not a nice way of asking the question, but don't see that as aggression. You know, it's passion, it's not aggression.
Absolutely. And I guess leading off of that, I want to talk about another thing that's kind of, I think for me, really central to that whole dynamic in terms of racism within the community. And I think, again, kind of coming back to Marsha P and all of the sort of origins of the struggle, anti-Blackness in the community is a huge thing. And I think also when you look at a lot of the things that are like really sort of popular within the community, a lot of the sort of language that we use, a lot of the words, drag culture, ballroom culture, all of these things really come from Black queer people. But yet we still have all this backcoding, and yet we still have fetishization and all of these things happening. So I guess any reflections on anti-Blackness within the community and how that links to this broader problem of sort of racism and kind of sort of whiteness, I guess, broadly in the community?
I mean, I can jump ahead with that one. So obviously, yeah, you know, as I've said, I'm a Black woman, and yeah, this community has a massive anti-Blackness problem. And I'll actually say that a show that really highlights that to me is Pose. If you've not seen it, I would recommend it. It's great. And it's a show, so the premise, if anybody who hasn't seen it, is it follows the lives of queer and trans Black people and Latinx people in New York in the, I think, late 80s, early 90s, and it kind of follows around the AIDS crisis and sort of the stories of transition, and then it's all around the ballroom scene. And that, even in and of itself, the ballroom scene, well, I'll touch on that. But Pose really highlighted to me the problem of anti-Blackness, because stories like that hadn't even ever been told, or really rarely been told up until now. I mean, the only other thing that we had that really, really told the stories of where ballroom culture comes from and how it was on the backs of Black people, Black queer people. The only other thing that told that story is Paris is Burning, which is a documentary about that scene. But even that is a problem, because Paris is Burning, great documentary, but the trans women of color in the documentary were never paid and died without seeing a dime. And so that even in itself is a problem. But in terms of anti-Blackness in this day and age, it is, I would say, one of the hardest things to see is that sort of adoption of AAVE, so African American Vernacular English. You know, we all say, you know, spill the tea and cis and whatever, and that's fine. But there are certain language that's absolutely co-opted. It is co-opted by, and I'm going to be honest here, white cis gay men. And when you point that out, you're met with reluctance. And when you point that out, you're met as, you know, as said earlier, you're met as angry. You're the angry woman of color. I have had white gay men in clubs touch my hair unasked for. I have had white gay men say that I'm sassy and that I'm their spirit animal and all of this and that, without even realizing how much of a microaggression that is. And then when you try to point it out, you get accused of being angry. And it is like, you can't win, because if you say nothing, they're going to think it's okay. If you say something, you're going to be accused of being angry. I choose being accused of being angry. I've been in situations where I've seen Black people, Black queer people treated so awfully by members of their own community. And to think that we're all meant to be supporting each other and uplifting each other, it is heartbreaking. And I think that's what fueled my fire so much last year when I wrote the Dear White Gays piece. I need this community to be doing more, to acknowledge its inherent anti-Blackness, to acknowledge where anti-Blackness comes from, to acknowledge it in their daily lives. It is not just a conversation of the moment. It is an everyday commitment, an everyday practice. And to think about how much Black people are erased. When you're enjoying RuPaul's Drag Race, are you thinking about where drag actually comes from? When you enjoy Stonewall and you enjoy the fruits of Pride, do you think about Marsha P. Johnson? Black people are constantly erased within the community. And as a Black woman and myself, it breaks my heart. And another issue is that if we're not being erased, we're then being fetishized. And I don't experience this as much, but my cousin, who is a Black gay man, he experiences this awfully. The fetishization of Black men, of their genitals, it is a problem. It is a massive problem. And that is sometimes used as an argument for, well, I couldn't possibly be racist and anti-Black. I love Black men. That's a problem in and of itself. You can't just refute and fix the problem of racism by then fetishizing. You have to really take the time to acknowledge your issues and acknowledge that your behavior hasn't been okay, and to drop the defensiveness. I would say, you know, we get accused as people of color of being the angry and aggressive ones, but actually I've had a lot of aggressiveness thrown my way just in calling out bad behavior. So that's one to think about.
Yeah, so just to come in on the back of that, just to think about colorism. So what does colorism mean? You know, are you going to be less discriminatory to somebody who's a lighter brown or a lighter Black? You know, colorism essentially is when people are aspiring to whiteness, and we have to really clearly understand, where does that come from? For those of you with kids, you know, what are these young people seeing on the TV? What are they seeing in the magazine? We have nowhere near enough representation to have positive role models in the media, the thing that people consume. So I think it's really important, as a South Asian, I think it's really important that I call out the colorism within the South Asian community. And again, you have to think about, well, where did this come from? Where is it rooted? And I think it's really important that we all understand what colorism means, you know, and you just have to look at the media. You just have to look at the role models that are out there, the people who are elevated into showbiz positions or positions of power. They always have a lighter skin. Is that because they're more palatable? Are people with dark skin not as palatable? It's a question to ask yourself. And again, something to unpack. Might not be that easy. But, you know, skin is just a shade of color. People spend a lot of money to get tanned. You know, you should not be discriminating people on what shade of black or brown or white they are. We're all the same people. And I think if there's any South Asians as well in the audience, I think it's really important that all of you embrace the colorism within our own community. It's something that's bringing us down. There's people who bleach their skin to be lighter. Like, it's just ridiculous. And, you know, in 2021, we should not be doing these things, and everyone should be proud of who they are, and nobody should be discriminated if they're lighter or darker. We are all people. We were born this way. We can't change the color of our skin.
Just to jump in on that quickly, that is such a key point that I was going to touch on later, is colorism, and especially somebody that benefits from it. I am a Black woman, but I am a lighter skinned Black woman. I'm not mixed race, although I get that assumed of myself a lot. But I very much benefit from colorism and actually challenging that. And particularly my experience as a queer woman as well, it is often the lighter skinned women that are closer to whiteness that are seen as more palatable and as more desirable. And that is something that is really, really off-putting. And I mean, I can kind of touch on this later, of the experiences of kind of women of color in this I was going to say sector, I'm not at work at the moment, in this space, but yeah, colorism is a really, really important issue. And like, if you're in the position of power to be calling that out, and if you're in a position where you are benefiting from it, challenge it, call it out, because it's just as big of a problem. It's not separate, it's part of racism, but it's also, you know, it's just as big of a problem. There is, it all goes back to white supremacy and the simulation to whiteness. But yeah, it's absolutely something that we should be discussing.
And that is the perfect bridge to the next point, because I think we need to talk about whiteness, particularly in our community, but also how whiteness, white supremacy in society as a whole impacts the LGBTQ community. And when we're talking about you know, assumptions that most queer people are white, and assumptions made about us, about our community, and that kind of exclude us, it all roots back to whiteness, and it all roots back to the cultures and the society that we live within. And I think, thinking about my own experiences, I kind of touched on this in the intro, but like coming out and sort of not seeing anyone else that was like me, tiny Latin community in London, and sort of very insular, and kind of didn't know any other queer people who were also Latin. And kind of just everything around me, just like, it is just whiteness, and these spaces are like all white, and you kind of feel that pressure to blend in and kind of fit in. And like there was definitely this tension between, like, if I want to discover myself and sort of explore this more and sort of be myself more, I need to kind of move away from my Latinhood and Latinidad and move towards whiteness. So I guess within that whole scope, like how does whiteness sort of show up within the community? How does it root itself in our identities, and sort of how do we move beyond that? How do we tackle that?
I'll go first this time, Liv, give you a bit of a break. So I think, well, the curse of whiteness, it is everywhere. And I think I should start by saying, you know, we are in Britain, and we have a government that thinks institutional racism doesn't exist. I'm going to categorically say that Britain is a racist country, and we need to be honest about that so that we can tackle it. Yeah, wow, whiteness. I mean, I could talk about whiteness forever. I think one of the first jobs I had was on Gardener's World, BBC Gardener's World, a very white middle class setting. And since having left, and 10 years down the line, you know, I've done a lot of unpacking to understand what I was doing in my places of work, what was I aspiring to. And in those settings, when I was in predominantly white middle class settings in TV or broadcast, I was, I guess, not challenging a lot of things. So, you know, sometimes we experience a lot of discriminations from stereotypes. I'd often have people say to me, oh, your people do this. I remember I had a boss once, and I overheard her on the phone say, oh yeah, no, I've got this Indian, I'm not even Indian, I'm Pakistani, but she was like, oh, I've got this Indian girl now and I'm going to get her to do the diversity work. I wasn't even at that level, you know, I was at a junior level. This was a very different time, and I know this person, they've unpacked a lot, and I know they would now understand that that was wrong. But what hope have our youngsters got if that's where they're starting off? And you're othered right from the start, whether that's at university. You know, I did film at university, and I was constantly othered, whether it was the way I spoke because of my working class background, or the fact that I was the only brown person in my course, brown or black person really. So it's understanding that representation matters as well. And you might not always know the right answer, but can you make sure that there's enough representation within your organization or your events? You know, can you bring in other people to help you understand? Because whiteness is everywhere. Whiteness is in the bars. Whiteness is on TV. Whiteness is at Pride. And again, I will say it again, Lady Phil created Black Pride out of necessity. And she shouldn't have had to do that. There is a Pride in London, and they've got a even bigger issue with racism, and their community board who all just and that there is a perfect example. Actually, they had a voluntary board of Black and POC members, and they weren't listened to. So then they all like resigned. That's shocking. That is shocking. An entire board to resign and not even last a year. And that again is the curse of whiteness, because white people thought that, okay, we can just get these people in, but we're not going to listen to them. You know, maybe these people were asking difficult questions, and we go back to that point of you're going to have those difficult questions. So if you get people in, you have to listen to them as well. And I'm really lucky to be working at Birmingham Pride. Like, no one has questioned anything we're doing. We can do what we want. We can make the changes we want. And that's the way it should be. You know, you have to show people respect. And I guess it comes down to understanding that your whiteness makes you more privileged than anyone else. And if you're a queer male, a cisgendered queer male, that makes you the most privileged of all. And you have to understand that. You can't get aggressive. You can't think the other person is the problem. I'm afraid whiteness is the problem.
Exactly that. Like, I mean, I could just jump right off the back of that. And exactly, it's just exactly that. And what I'm going to touch on is that, and this is still any white person in the audience, we're not attacking you for being white. It's not a personal attack, but it is an acknowledgement that whiteness and white supremacy and colonialism and the legacy it left on from that has harmed people that look like me. That it's harmed people, you know, queer people of color are some of the most harmed people by colonialism, capitalism, and that all comes from white supremacy and whiteness. It's not a personal attack, but it is an acknowledgement that as a community, as a race, that whiteness can be whiteness can be a problem, whiteness can be a threat, and to be open and acknowledging of that. And it's about almost flipping that and thinking about what's an alternative, and what's an alternative way of looking at it. I'm not a problem, but actually I'm somebody with the power to make change, and you have to be open to it, right? Like, you know, you just have to be open to it. And I think whiteness in the community has such a detrimental impact. The image of being LGBT is white. It is very, very overwhelmingly white. And that is something that I struggled with my coming out. I took several years to really fully come out of the closet. And one of the big things was because I didn't fit the image of a lesbian. All my lesbian representation, I wasn't really seeing people like me. And if I was seeing people like me or people who were Black, it was very, very light-skinned. And even though I'm a light-skinned woman, I like to see representation of, you know, kind of all shades of the spectrum of Blackness. And I wanted to see more spaces, and I still want to see more spaces. You know, I watch sort of queer TV series, and I'll be like, why aren't there more Black characters, or why aren't there more just like people of color? Like, why is it still so overwhelmingly white? And even just small things like, you know, the image of, and I'll use the term WLW, which is women loving women, it's still very overwhelmingly white, which was what put me kind of, not put me off, but like really, really alienated me from declaring myself as a lesbian and really, really assimilating to the community. Even the small thing of like, if anybody knows, like those sort of like girls pages that I used to really love when I was a teenager and really, really coming into my queerness, but it was always white couples. And in general, the image, particularly in WLW kind of media, is white couples or white and very, very light skin. You even see it kind of, I'm really, really like big, and I love wasting a lot of time on TikTok. I'm really, really deep in that scene. And obviously my feed is very, very queer. And it will be stuff I'm kind of about, like, you know, sort of like lesbian characters on TV, or like queer women on TV, still predominantly white. And I'm still like, I don't see myself represented. And I actually had a disagreement with somebody in the comments where I was like, you know, this is great. Like, I love seeing lesbian representation, but you guys need to be challenging the fact that it's all white women in this video. It is all white women. And, you know, I get kind of like a defensive response back of, oh, well, you know, there's blah, blah, blah person from this show and blah, blah, blah person from this show. And I'm like, yeah, you can bring out a handful of people, but then the rest of the representation is all white. How do you think that feels for women of color? How do you think that feels to not feel represented? And that's also kind of bad because it negatively reinforces the image of like being LGBT as a white thing. So I have on the one side, you know, from the Black community, I get that kind of, oh, well, you know, like being a lesbian, that's a white people thing, because that image is reinforced. And then on this side, it's like, well, we don't want to invite you in because you know, your whole community is homophobic. Again, you've got to address, where did Black people inherit homophobia from? Cough, colonialism, cough. But, you know, so it's a really hard experience. It's a really, really alienating one. And I think that is why people like Lady Phil build the spaces. And even on a smaller scale, when I went to university, I went to the University of Leeds. And during my time there, a queer Black woman called Manisha sort of formed a cutie book society. And it took from her being there to her just coming up to graduation for it to be actually registered as a society, because they couldn't see why they needed a separate one to the LGBT society. Let me tell you something. I went to one LGBT society meeting. I did not feel very comfortable, because when white people have that privilege, they never think to look around a room and be like, why is this room all white? But people of color do not have that privilege. You walk into a room and you know, if you're a person of color, you walk into a room and you suss it out immediately. And to kind of touch on almost like more of an action, what white queer people can be doing more for people of color is making sure that these spaces are friendly, that these spaces are inviting, really challenging people, calling stuff out, you know, like try to break down these barriers rather than just being like, oh, but there's that tiny bit of representation here, there. Make it representation everywhere.
And I just
oh, Jon, yeah, just gonna come in on the back of that and just say it just reminded me of diversity schemes, and I was just going to say that if anybody's thinking that diversity schemes are the answer, then you might want to think again as well, because I joined the BBC around about 12 or 13 years ago. I don't work for the BBC now, but I joined on a diversity scheme 13 years ago. Nothing has changed. I speak to the people, the commissioners who hired me, you know, nothing has changed. And what I, just to echo, in case nobody heard what Liv said, why do you not see that your room is not diverse or inclusive when you walk into a space? We have an organization called the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham at the moment. Now, the entire office is a sea of whiteness. How did nobody ever see that? When you're employing people, when you're building your teams, when you're building your communities, like, how do you not see that? Because Liv and I see it all the time. And so I think, again, you have to start putting these this mind frame and this thought process at the front of mind. And, you know, you need to start challenging yourself. And just a simple thing, every meeting you have, or every workplace you're part of, and if you're in a position of privilege, have a look around the next time you walk in. You know, how inclusive is it? How diverse is it? Those are the questions you have to ask yourselves every day, because Liv and I ask those questions when we get on a bus, when we walk into a restaurant, when we walk into a club, wherever we go, that is the question. So I think that's the key thing to remember. It baffles me how people don't see it. It really baffles me.
And I think just to like cap off the kind of section on whiteness, so like we could talk about this forever, but I think when like whiteness, the normalization of whiteness, and kind of like I think white people generally don't necessarily perceive themselves as being white, as having a race. It's like racism and race and ethnicity and identity is something that like brown people have, it's people of color that have, and we have to think about it. And I think because of that, we can almost forget and sort of not realize our own role in maintaining whiteness and white supremacy culture, and we don't necessarily analyze and look at this enough. But whiteness is a system of oppression. You know, when you look at whiteness, how it was constructed in the age of colonialism to sort of separate out white European populations from colonized populations, and kind of separate and sort of keep that distance and sort of prevent class solidarity and all of these different things. We need to look at it from that perspective and analyze ourselves and think about how, you know, why don't we have many brown people of color as friends? Why you know, like we need to sort of tackle this within ourselves and really think about it. And I guess bridging off that, I want to just look at how what needs to change in our community. What's your hot take in terms of like what is the things that like need to change? Yeah, who wants to take that?
I can jump ahead with that. In terms of what needs to change, so like I kind of mentioned as the start of a call to action, is like, well, taking action. You know, don't be passive. That is the one thing that I see happen quite a lot, is a very, very passive attitude, and it only being a conversation when it's relevant. That was what got me so infuriated last year, and what made me write Dear White Gays was, why haven't you ever had this conversation before? Why haven't you ever acknowledged that your whole friend group is white, but you live in London, one of the most diverse cities in the UK? You know, you're contributing to that image of only white people are LGBT, and it really, really alienates other people. You need to think about, I'd say, sort of two main things is the education that you need to take as white people, and then the steps that you can be doing to support people of color. And in terms of education, it's about, and I hate to use the phrase do the reading. I mean do the reading in a very, very sort of pejorative way. I don't necessarily mean do the reading. And I recognize and acknowledge that reading in and of itself is a very, very elitist thing. You know, I kind of read these big academic texts. You know, I'm reading, a little bit of a plug here, but I'm reading A Decolonial Feminism at the moment, and it's taken me ages because it is very, very academic. But there are always other resources. You know, there's podcasts, you can take your books in the form of audio books. That's another way I've really like taken in information. There's YouTube. There's a lot of other ways. There's Pose, which obviously it is a TV drama. It's not a documentary, but it is very informative, and it gives you an insight into the experiences of queer people of color, and especially an insight into the history of queer people of color. You can be doing the reading. You can be talking to people of color within reason. And I cannot stress within reason enough. Do not overexploit your queer friends of color and ask them everything, because that isn't fair. You can ask your queer friends of color for direction, and what book would you recommend? Do you think this is a good idea? Oh, could you just inform me on this? But if they shout and they say, you know what, this is a little bit too much, then you got to go out there and do the work yourself, get involved in the spaces. And this is something I do myself. You know, I am a cis woman, and I am trying to learn and understand a lot more about the trans experience in the UK, because some of my closest friends are trans men, and I have known about their experiences for years, but never really gone out and done the work until the last year and kind of learning about that experience. And I always tell them, you know, like, do let me know, am I asking too much of you? Because I can go out, I can do my own research, and it is a thing of like putting myself in the spaces. I went to the trans rights protest back in August, and I learned so much through that and was so grateful. And like, if I have had a conversation, I say I'm so grateful for that. And I'm doing my education, but trying to be aware that I'm not going to overexploit trans people for their labor. And that's the same thing that can be done by white people in the LGBT community, is that you can sort of ask and you can have those conversations, but you need to be aware of how much are you overexploiting somebody for their labor. And then the other strand, I would say, of what you can be doing is uplifting, amplifying, and supporting queer people of color. And that was something that I stressed last year. I said, you know, amplify my voice. I am a queer Black woman. I've written this piece, amplify my voice. And I did get invited. I got invited to write for the Huffington Post. I got invited to speak in podcasts. But then that sort of petered out after a while. And I haven't really been invited and to talk about this for a while, until recently, until Jon invited me to this panel. And that is Jon as a queer person of color looking out for me. But where was the white person inviting me to do this? You know what I mean? Like, kind of keep that going, keep that commitment going, keep continuing to amplify these voices, and trust that we are more likely to have the answer, and to kind of have that, you know, we've got the lived experience to offer insight into what's the best way forward. Listen to us when we're saying it, amplify our voices, pay people for their time, you know, like, yeah, and also just be aware, be supportive. If there is something going on right now, you know, be aware and reach out to somebody and actually do it, and do it consistently. I had a lot of white people reach out to me last summer. Where are they now? Who knows? You know, the people who have stuck by me have stuck by me, and they know who they are, and they're actually in this call, and I love them very much. But there are other people who don't stick to their words, and I need to be seeing more of that. To be the best ally is to be constantly committed to learning, educating, supporting, and like just your own personal development and growth. So yeah, I see it as a dual strand of educating yourself and amplifying the voices of those that were most marginalized. I think last year when I wrote Dear White Gays, I said something like, you know what it's like to be on the margins of society, so why do you do it to people of color? Stand up for them, amplify their voices, shout, make a fuss, you know, support us.
Yeah, everything Liv said, like times 10, times a million. So I think like the key thing for anyone, you know, watching us today is you've got to start by unpacking a lot that's sitting inside you. And now that's not going to be an easy process, but you can begin by thinking, like Liv said, who are your friends? You know, what do your circle of friends look like? Or maybe it was Jon. What does your place of work look like? If you're a leader of a team, what does the team you employ look like? You need to start looking at every little part of your life and understand what kind of patterns you're seeing, and some of them might not be nice. But then the key thing is, then you've got to, you know, find Black people and people of color to be your friends, but it might not come across that well, because, you know, if you're looking for somebody to save you, that's never going to happen. You have to save yourself. And Liv and I, as brown and Black women, are having to save ourselves constantly, every day, every hour, whether it's a microaggression, whether it's a challenge at work, whether it's racism on the street, whatever it is, we're constantly having to do that. But there are people out there that will want to give you time. There might be people in your workplaces, there might be people in your communities. And, you know, if these people don't exist, go to events. There are many events. Okay, COVID has kind of, you know, made it a bit difficult for in real life events, but there's still lots happening on Zoom. And there are people who actually will pay, you can pay, and they'll come and speak for you, you know, or they'll come and do a workshop for you. There's people who specialize in intersectionality. I go into schools now and talk about intersectionality, and I'm not a teacher. I'm doing it because no one else is, you know, and I'm hoping other people will share that journey. And this is why teachers, and a lot of the times heterosexual teachers, that will invite me in to talk about racism, homophobia, everything that covers intersectionality. So I think that's important. And also just remember that if you go up to a Black person or brown person and you want them to make you feel better, that's not always going to happen. We've got generational trauma, be that at the hands of migration, colonialism, white supremacy. The list is endless. So if somebody's not willing to talk to you, that's okay too. Just move on. Don't make it a thing, because then that's a microaggression. Nobody owes you anything in this time. But generally, in your circle of life, you will find people, and you might just have to unpack and question yourself as to why you hadn't reached out to them before. Create events, if you're in the community, create community events, bring everyone together. Food is a fantastic thing to bring people together. It's also a way to celebrate your cultures and understand other people's culture as well. And then, of course, cultural appropriation is a thing. So, don't try and suddenly become Black or brown or cultural appropriation. I could go on about that for like a whole day. But I think if anybody's interested, you should do readings on cultural appropriation. I'm not the most academic person, but Liv might be able to give you some books. But if not, go to Google. Like, there'll be a whole list of books there for you to find, because there's that fine line of wanting to support, but then are you pushing it so far that all of a sudden you're trying to become that culture or that ethnicity? I think that's really important, not to fall into that trap. And so, yeah, the most important thing is just to listen. You've all listened today, you've stayed. I've been watching the participants, you've stayed. Everyone who arrived hasn't left. And that's positive. You should be proud of yourself to be listening, because this isn't an easy conversation. But I think the key thing to always remember is, for Liv and I, or for people like Liv and I, this is a constant. We can't switch it off. We wake up thinking this, we go to sleep thinking this. We might wake up in the middle of night with a nightmare over something that happened or past trauma. So that's the key thing to remember. Try and make racism and anti-racism policies. I mean, anti-racism, what does that? You're just a racist. Don't be a racist. It's as simple as that. Don't be a racist. But I think try and experience yourself. Maybe one day walk down the street and think, oh, what would it be like if I was Black or brown? Simple as that. And you will start seeing things very differently. And then, I just think it's positive you're here. And Liv and I are on social medias, so I'm sure you can reach out if you have any further questions. But listen and don't get angry. That's the key thing, because that's the thing I get sick of. People getting angry when I'm just trying to have a conversation. And people like us have never had this opportunity to talk before. So if we're saying something and it doesn't feel comfortable, just listen and then go home and unpack it. Don't respond with aggression.
Lean into the uncomfortableness. That is the biggest thing that I've learned, just kind of through a lot of stuff. But know that you're not always going to get it right, and that actually having these conversations will not validate you, and that no matter how good of a person you may think you might be, and that you're not racist and you couldn't possibly be racist, maybe you are. Just maybe you are. And be open to that. Drop the defensive. Be ready to have an open and honest conversation. We are giving away a lot of emotional labor. Even in events like this is giving away a lot of emotional labor. When you're having conversations with somebody who's being kind enough to have this conversation with you as a friend or as an acquaintance, really be appreciative of it. Don't go in with your own, this is what I'm going to get out of this conversation. Be open, be ready for, oh, this is going to change my perception, and this has actually made me think of this. And yeah, take the time to unpack.
That was all beautiful, and it hopefully gives everyone lots to think about and lots to process and act on moving forward. And I want to thank everyone for being here, and I want to thank especially Saima and Liv for being here and giving all that emotional labor. And I just want to finish on something more positive and affirmative. And I just want us to chat just like a quick thing of like, what brings you joy in your queerness, in your Blackness, in your brownness? And I'll share one for myself quickly, because it was just this really nice moment. I was seeing family back in Ecuador, and I'd met up with a friend who sort of came out after I knew her from school, and she came out and we went to a gay club together, and it was just the weirdest thing, like this clashing of like my cultural and ethnic identity and my queerness. And it was this beautiful space just with lots of dancing, and there was this like kind of drag birthing ceremony of like this drag troupe, like kind of really leaning and borrowing a lot from like indigenous and traditional cultures and sort of things. And it was this great sort of atmosphere and like amazing thing. And it's just like this one moment where I thought like these things can come together, and like this is how it's done, and that was really cool. So yeah, what brings you joy as queer women of color?
Okay, I'll go. It's very simple, just existing in my community in Birmingham and being so visible and being authentic, my queer Muslim self. And actually the thing that brings me most joy is usually on a Friday or Saturday, I'll order a Chinese, and then the Uber driver, most of the times, 80% of the time, will recognize me, and it's somebody I've gone to school with or somebody from the inner city community that I grew up in. And, you know, as whiteness tells me, my community are all homophobic. But when they're delivering me my Chinese or they meet me in the mosque, they have nothing but love. And I know they know everything about me. I've been on the news, I've been everywhere. And they embrace me with nothing but love. And yeah, they're interested in me, not my sexuality. They're just interested in me being my authentic self. And, you know, it's my color of my skin that defines me. Not my sexuality. So I think, yeah, just living my authentic self. And when Britain is telling me, and, you know, this Islamophobic rhetoric that Muslims are homophobic and you can't live your best life, well, I am. And, you know, that for me is great. Just waking up every day, being my authentic self.
Honestly, Saima, like same. Same, being my authentic self, being my unapologetic self. That is one thing that I've very much leaned into. And as Jon introduced me, I am a self-described outspoken Black lesbian. I am outspoken, I am unapologetic. I spent so many years in the closet apologizing for my identity. I spent time coming out to people in my family and still apologizing for my identity. And I had a hard period of time where I didn't think I could reconcile my Blackness with my queerness. But I'm over that now, and I have reconciled it because I've decided to stop apologizing. I am Black, and I am Black as F. I don't know if I can swear, so I'm going to say I'm Black as F and I'm queer as F, and I'm proud of it. And what brings me joy is like queer people of color solidarity. And like, I will give you a prime example of right now, I am doing this talk from the house of somebody who was my Twitter mutual for a while. We just met and she's letting me use their laptop and do this whole event because we're going out later, and the pre's are at her house, the pre-drinks, sorry, I'm using my terminology, but the pre's are at her house. And it was like, oh, could I just come and do this event and come straight from here? And that would make my life so much easier. And they were like, yeah, absolutely. No questions asked. And that is like solidarity. And that is just like a small thing. And like, we just briefly met and said hello. And I was like, that level of somebody who gets it and who understands, and that affinity with each other, cutie puck spaces for me are so powerful. I really, really found a massive home in a cutie puck space in Leeds when I was at university in my third year. That brought me so much like strength and positivity. I found a lot of power when I went on a 3-day residential with Stonewall, particularly for people of color, young people of color who are campaigners. And like, these spaces are the ones that keep me going, that fulfill me, that bring me joy. Even talking with Saima and Jon tonight has given me such joy, and I feel like great and ready to go out and like spend some more time with Cutie Pop. And also like, and again, shout out to my friends who are in the audience, they know who they are, the people who are willing to listen as well, the people who are willing to listen and learn. And I think with my friend group as well, we very much educate each other. Like I said, they are trans men, they educate me. I'm a Black woman, I educate them. But having the people that do not make me feel like I have to apologize, that is really important to me and brings me a lot of joy.
That's beautiful. And yeah, thanks again to both of you and to everyone. And I hope everyone takes the time to just digest and unpack and think about this and talk to your friends about Blackness, talk to your friends about racism, and just be comfortable having these conversations. And yeah, thank you. Happy Pride.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.